Welcome to your tutorial on how to make a flower. So we're going to be creating this flower with its pot. We're going to put materials on it and render it out. The first thing that we want to do is open Cinema. Once you're in Cinema, we're going to take out a cylinder. You can find your cylinders in your primitive objects menu by going up here to the cube, clicking and leaving it pressed, and then finding cylinder. If you let go of your mouse on top of cylinder, this will take out a cylinder. Alright, so the first part that we're going to make of this is going to be the pot. First, let's try to approximate how we would want it to look. So I'm going to use the little yellow dots here to try to approximate this. So I'm going to make this a bit smaller. Right now it is 200 centimeters. I don't want it to be that big, so I'm going down to around 140. And then I actually want it to be kind of cartoonish. So I'm going to make it much bigger in the radius until maybe around 75. I approximated it, but I want to make sure that now I go to my attributes and actually write in those numbers. So 140 for my height and 75 for my radius. Try to follow along with me with all of my numbers for now. Later on, you will be able to create your own flower. Okay, so now we have the first step, but I'm noticing if I zoom in that my edges are a little bit too sharp. So to fix this, I want to change my rotation segments. Let's go up to 40. Alright, so now that we have this, we want to start adding deformers. So the first deformer we're going to use is the taper. So once again, we're going to go up here to this Create Tools bar, find the Deformers menu, click and leave it pressed, and find Taper. We're going to make this taper a child of the cylinder, and then press Fit to Parent, which is this button right here. It's a little bit hidden. I'm going to pull this out so you can see it better. Fit to Parent. Now this taper is going to affect the entire object that it is around. So we are going to go and instead of increasing the strength, because increasing would make it smaller on top, we're going to decrease it. So I want that to be strength -50, and that just tapered outwards. But I don't want this curvature, so I'm going to decrease the curvature to 0, and there we go. Okay, so now I want to hide this bounding box because it is very handy while you're using it, but as soon as you start adding a lot of deformers, it gets in the way. So I'm gonna go up to the visibility dots and click twice, once and twice to make it invisible in the viewport. It would still show up if I select it, but if it's not selected, then we don't have to see the bounding box. Before we move on, this cylinder currently has very sharp edges. So to fix this, we're going to go to the Caps tab and check on Fillet. This is going to round the edges of the cylinder. Right now it's still a little sharp, so let's increase this to 4 segments to show you here with garage shading lines. This is 3, this is 4. And then I also want to increase the radius, which is going to make this fillet a little bigger. There we go. That looks better. Now, if we're happy with this, I'm going to name it pod_base and move on to the next step. The next part is we're going to add a ring around this pod. So we're going to go to our primitives menu, take out a tube, and with our move tool up here, or pressing E on your keyboard, we're going to move this upwards until it's about halfway through the top of the pod base. Now I'm going to change to my top view by going to my 4-panel view button and then clicking on the 4-panel view of the top so that I can see how my tube, which is the highlight orange, is interacting with my pod base, which is the black part on the back. The outer radius of this tube should be bigger than our pod, so we're going to increase this until around 120 centimeters. And then the inner radius we're also going to increase to around 100 centimeters. So now we can see that the inner radius and the outer radius are interacting with the pot base and they're covering it. Now we can change back to our 4-panel view, and right here, without even going into the right view, I know that this is too big. So I'm going to decrease this as well. This is the height. So I can do that by clicking on the little dot and approximating, or simply by writing in the height that I want, which in this case, I think 40 might be good, or maybe 35. This is the great thing about working with non-destructive objects. You can change your mind at any point. If you wanted a very thin one, you could go 10 centimeters and then maybe pull it up a little bit. Or if you wanted a really thick one, you can do, let's say, 80 centimeters, and this is the style that you're going for. Nothing is permanent as long as you're working with non-destructive geometry. I'm gonna leave mine at 35, and again, the edges are a little bit too sharp. There's not enough rotation segments, so I'm going to also increase this to 36. Much smoother. And add the same fillet that we added to the pot base. So check on fillet, and instead of 3, since we did 4 on the other one, let's keep it the same. So 4 segments and 4 centimeters in the radius, which makes the rounding a lot nicer. I'm going to pull up my tube a little bit more so that the axis is kind of halfway through the pot base. And there's enough space here so that we can put the soil. All right, that looks good. Let's name it pot ring. And now let's add the soil. So to add the soil, we're going to find a landscape object. And we're going to change the way that it looks by clicking on spherical. Using our scale tool up here, or pressing T on your keyboard, we're going to scale this down until it fits inside of our pot. Using our move tool up here, or E on the keyboard, we're going to move this upwards. I'm going to use T again to scale it down more. And around there it looks good. All right, so first thing is that up here there is a bit of pinching where the landscape closes up the sphere. So I'm going to rotate this to the side so that we don't have to see that. So I'm pressing R on my keyboard, or you can go up here, and I'm going to rotate this in Z. So I'm going to select my blue rotation, click and drag until I reach about 90 degrees. If you hold Shift, your rotation will happen in increments of 10. All right, so now we don't have to see that pinching. The next step is actually making this look more like soil. So we're going to use the deformer here. You're gonna click on the deformer menu and find the FFD. Click and drag to make the FFD a child of the landscape. Click Fit to Parent. And what we wanna do with this FFD is that it's going to help us flatten out this landscape. So I'm going to go to point mode so that I can see the points of the FFD. Do Command A to select all of them. And then with my scale tool, press T on your keyboard. I want to scale this down in Y, which is the green one. This is going to flatten out this object. Make sure that you don't flatten it out completely. So up until we reach about 20%, I think looks fine for me. You can always select with your life selection by going up here with the 9. You can select certain points and move them so that they fit better within your pot. So let's say if I want this to be a little bit more circular, I could just bring it in here, say, look, here's not covering enough. So I could select all the points that I know are here and move it out slightly. Make sure that it is not coming out of the side of the pot. All right, looking good. Now let's hide that FFD, once again, visibility dots, and clicking until it gets red. And the landscape is a little sharp, so we're going to use a deformer that I didn't mention before, which is the smoothing deformer. So if you go to your deformers menu and find smoothing, make that smoothing a child of the landscape. And as you can see, the smoothing smooths your geometry. 100% is a little much, so we're going to decrease that Mine, I'll say around 20% looks good enough because it still has the creases that make it look like cartoonish soil, but it's not as sharp as it looked without the smoothing. So I'm actually gonna deactivate it so you can see the difference. All right, I think that looks great. So now I'm going to name this landscape soil. And now that we have these three parts, the next step would be to start making the stem. But before I do that, I want to start organizing my file. So I'm going to take out a null, click and drag until I can select all three, the pot base, the pot ring, and the soil, and make them a child of this null. Then I'm going to name this null the pot. And now I can easily collapse all three of these parts into one object, which is the null. All right, so before we move on to the next step, let's make sure that we save. You can go File, Save, or press Ctrl or Command S. Give it a name and save. Okay, now we can move on. So the next step is making the stem. To make the stem, we're going to use another cylinder. So click and find the cylinder. And let's, with our move tool, so E on your keyboard, let's bring it upwards. And of course, make it a lot thinner than it currently is. So I clicked on my cylinder so that I can see the attributes. And I'm going to go to the Object tab, if it's not already there, and change the radius to be a lot smaller than that. I will use 7 centimeters. I will leave the height the same. Make sure that you position your stem above the pot, but still dug into the soil so that it is not floating. You can see here in the coordinate that the stem is only being changed in Y since I'm only holding the Y axis here. So make sure that your stem is dug into the soil, but there's still enough to work with out here. All right, so to give this a little bit more life and so that it's not just a normal cylinder, let's add a bulge deformer. So take out the bulge deformer, make it a child of your cylinder, and fit to parent. Here we want the bulge to give it a little more attitude. So we're going to decrease the strength to -50. And that looks a lot more interesting. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to select my bulge. With my E move tool selected, I'm going to move it up slightly in Y so that this bottom part is still being affected because my bulge mode is limited. So it's still being affected, but it's not being as affected as everything else. And instead, the actual interesting part is happening a little bit higher up. If you press Command R or Control R, you can see your render preview. Or simply click here. Okay, so now let's hide the bulge so we don't have to see it and rename the cylinder stem. Next, let's make the bud of the flower. For this, we're going to use an oil tank right here. And we're gonna bring it upwards, so the move tool, and again, only going up in Y. I want this oil tank to be facing the correct orientation, so I'm going to change the orientation of it. Instead of +Y, which makes it face up and down, I want it to be +Z, which is going to make it face forwards or backwards. As you can see, if I change right here, this is our front view. All right, so let's change some settings here because it doesn't look very great. First thing that I want to change is that it's way too big, so I'm going to reduce the radius until I reach around 42. Next, I'm going to change the height until I get to 36. Now I want the cap height to still be there. And this is the reason why I even chose an oil tank, because you get this flat edge that works as a very nice bed to put the petals on. So the cap height, I want it to be around 10, 11. And then of course it is very jagged, so let's increase the rotation segments. And that's looking a lot better. Now to make this look a little bit better, let's add a spherify deformer. So take out the spherify, make it a child of my oil tank, and press hit to parent. I'm going to reduce the strength of my spherify because I don't want it to change the bud that much. All I wanted to do is make the front part of the bud a little bit more round. So I'm gonna bring it slightly up, make it a little bit smaller. Think around 40 centimeters works, and then just bring it slightly up so that this is pointed a little bit more outwards. If like mine, yours is looking a little bit jagged as well, that is because there's not enough segments in this front portion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more segments there. So I'm going to go back to my oil tank and increase my cap segments. All right, that looks great. Let's hide that spherify and name this bud. Now we're going to create our first petal, and to create this we're going to use a capsule. Take out a capsule, move it with our move tool upwards in Y only. Until it is around where you'd want your first petal to be. Of course, it's too big, so let's change that. Let's bring this down to around 30 or 31. Bring the height down to around 100 to around 105, and then place it again. So I want it to be intersecting with the petal. I also want it to be very smooth, so I'm going to increase my rotation segments right now to 32, and then my cap and my height segments to 8 respectively. And now that we're here, let's actually shape this. So to shape this, we're going to use an FFD. So go to your deformer menu and find the FFD. Make it a child of the capsule and click fit to parent. We're going to increase the amount of grid points that we have because we want to have a little bit more room to play around with. So I'm going to put 5 grid points in X, 5 in Y, and 5 in Z. And now that we have this, let's first flatten this petal a little bit. So I'm going to select Command A or Control A to select all points. Go to my scale tool. And I want to flatten this in Z, so the blue axis here. Flatten it enough that it can fit in this flat part of the oil tank, but not too much that it looks like a piece of paper. All right, now with our life selection, what we want to do is that we want to select certain points so that we can start giving this the shape that we want. In your perspective view, when you have your life selection and you're using an FFD, whatever you select actually works kind of like a laser. So I just selected all these points in the front, but all of these in the back also got selected. And that is both great and dangerous. Great because it's gonna help us with our workflow, but dangerous because you can, by mistake, let's say you think you're only selecting these 3, and by mistake you selected these 2 in the back as well, and now your change is going to be affecting the back. So just something to be aware of. We're going to use this to our advantage by just seeing it from this front view of it and then selecting through as if we're using a laser. So first is that I want this bottom part to be a little bit tighter, so I'm going with my life selection to kind of brush through to make sure that I am selecting everything. So I'm clicking and dragging, I haven't let go yet. I'm just gonna make sure that I'm selecting through all of these points, and I'm gonna go around and rotate around this to make sure that I did that. It looks like they're all selected, so now I can use my scale tool, and I want to scale it only in X, which is gonna be left and right. Right, so I'm gonna tighten this a little bit more. And I'm going to repeat this process now up here. Selecting through as if I have a paintbrush. making sure that I selected all of them, which I didn't. So I want to now hold shift and do the same thing again. Just be careful that you're only selecting one row at a time. Now they all look selected. Go to my scale tool, and then in this case, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Same process up here. I'm gonna bring this downwards with my move tool. And once again up here. Make sure that I have everything selected. And I'm gonna make this slightly bigger, pressing T to go to my scale tool and scaling out in X. Notice the difference. I'm going to deactivate the FFD just to show you what the FFD did. We're going to have to further edit this once we have more than one petal so that they fit well together, but for now I'm going to leave mine like this. Remember that you can play around with your FFD as much as you like. You can make your flower petal in any shape that you like. Right now, try to follow along with me. Later on, you will be able to make absolutely any flower you want. All right, so I'm going to hide this FFD and name this petal. I'm also going to increase my rotation segments a bit more because it still looks a little bit too jagged. So 16, 16 for both the height and the cap, and then 48 for the rotation. So now we're going to use a trick so that making the rest of the petals is a little bit easier. We're going to change where our axis is. We can't change the axis of a primitive object, so we're going to make this primitive object a child of a null. So take out a null, make your petal a child of the null, and let's rename this petal Auric for original, because this is going to be our first petal. You can see that the axis of this petal is actually all the way down in 0, 0, 0. But we want to change this. So we're going to click on enable axis so that we're in a mode where we can change the axis, and only moving the Y axis. Make sure that you're only moving in the green. You want to move this up until it's around the center of your bud. To make sure that I'm near the center, I'm going to change to my front view, zoom in, and drop my axis right there. Now to get out of this, I'm going to once again select enable axis, and that's going to take me out of this mode. So now if I were to go move this, it's moving the actual petal and not the axis. Make sure that you're not in enable axis if you're trying to move something, because you're only going to move the axis of it. So the reason we did this is because now as we add more petals, we can just rotate them around the bud. So then let's add more petals. To create more petals and not have to do this process all over again, we're going to use something called an instance object. And what this does is that it gives you a clone of your original object. This clone will do anything that the original object does. So we only have to worry about changing one petal, and then all the other petals are going to interact with it. All the other petals are going to do the same thing. To find this instance object, you're going to click and leave this menu pressed and go to instance. Because I had my petal Auric null selected, it created a petal Auric instance. And this is an instance of my petal or of my original petal null. If you don't have anything selected, you're going to get an instance of nothing. To make sure that you have an instance of something, you must have something in your reference object down here in the instance attributes. So if you created an instance that has nothing, just delete it for now, go back and select the object that you want to make a clone of, and then you do your instance. So for our first petal, I'm going to name this petal 1. And I want 6 petals around this bud. So we're gonna do a little bit of math. So I know that the circle is 360 degrees. And if I want 6, I need to divide that by 6. So 360 divided by 6, which gives you 60. Now that tells you that each petal needs to be 60 degrees away from the previous one. If I go to my petal 1 and go to my rotate tool, I can start rotating this to the right until I reach 60. You can do this manually like this and hold shift to go in steady increments, or you can do it by just selecting your petal, going to your coordinates, and changing your rotation in Z to 60. Now, what I'm noticing is that my petals are not big enough for this 60-degree rotation. So I'm going to go back to my original petal, make my FFD visible, and further edit my points until this gap here is filled. So I'm going to first, maybe let's try just making everything bigger. So Command A to select everything, T to go to my scale to, and then clicking and dragging outside will just scale everything uniformly. So that helps a lot, but there's still a bit of a gap here. So I'm going to hide my bud and select all of these points here in the bottom, making sure they're all selected. We're gonna make this bigger until they kind of touch, and this part we're going to make smaller. Now we can further edit this shape to get something that you're happy with. Make sure that as you're editing things, your petal does not go over this flat edge, so it doesn't change the circle of this bud. Okay, so I'm gonna hide my FFD, and now that I know that this gap is filled, I can keep making instances of my petal original. So I'm gonna click petal original, find my instance object, and now I get another petal original. So I'm gonna do petal 2. And this one, instead of being 60, is gonna go all the way to 120. I'm gonna do that again. You can undock this menu by leaving your mouse hovering over here, and this just undock the menu. So now you can put it over here on the side and then just press instance, 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 right? So now I have created multiple instances. I'm gonna rename them and then place them. And there we go. We have all of our petals placed around. To make this front look a little bit more exciting, we're going to add another spherify. In this case, I want the spherify to affect all petals at once. So I'm going to group them together. I can select all of them and press Option or Alt G, and this is the shortcut to group something into a null, and name this petals. And then in here I will bring a spherify deformer, bring it to the center, and as you see right now, it's doing something different than what we want. What we wanted to do is that we wanted to come forwards and then just lightly affect the flowers so that they look like they are being moved forward. I'm just going to reduce how much this is happening because for me that is a little bit too strong. I want something a little more subtle. So I'm activating it and deactivating it so you can see the change. I'm gonna hide my Spherify in the viewport and then Command S to save the work that I have so far. The last thing that we're going to add here is gonna be some leaves. So instead of doing this from scratch, let's take a copy of our petal original. So Command or Control C in our petal original and Command or Control V. This is going to paste this petal original outside of our petal null. And we want just the petal, we don't want the null. So I'm going to click and drag to move this out of the null and delete the null by pressing backspace. I'm gonna quickly rename this petal to leaf and then make sure that with my move tool, I'm only moving down in Y, place it down in the soil. Now I'm gonna press R to change to my rotate tool and rotate it around Y till I reach 90 degrees. Then E for my move tool. And place it as if it was a leaf. Obviously, it still looks a lot like a petal, so now we're going to go to our FFD and further edit this until it looks more like a leaf. Okay, that looks more like a leaf. So now again, I'm going to hide my FFD. And obviously this isn't exactly what we want. We want this leaf to bend to the side. So we're going to use a bend deformer to help us with this. So I took out a bend by just clicking on the deformers because the bend is the first one. And then make this bend a child of my leaf. Click fit to parent. And I'm going to increase the strength just to show you what happens. The bend breaks the geometry of this because it's happening after the FFD. So you want to make sure that your FFD is your first child and your bend is your second child. So I'm going to move my FFD upwards. Make sure it's still a child of my leaf. I'm just moving it upwards so that this is number 1 and this is number 2. And now you can see that your bend is no longer breaking the geometry. I'm making a change in the angle so that it goes in the correct way that I want it to. So I'm going to change this to negative 90 degrees or 270, whatever you prefer. I'm also gonna change the mode on this bend from limited to unlimited so that it affects the entire petal equally. So everything right now is being bended 103 degrees. I just think that this makes for a better look and everything is now being affected equally, as you can see if I were to move this. Once you're happy with it, I'm going to hide this bend and make an instance of this leaf. Clicking on leaf, going to instance and rotating this instance. And I will rotate this instance. So I'm going to move it over here with my move tool and then R for my rotate tool and rotate it 180 degrees so that it's on the other side of this flower. Now anything I do to this one will also happen to the other one. So I will group both of them and name them leaves. To add a little bit more to these leaves, I actually want to stack a second bend. So I'm going to take out a bend, make it a child of the leaf. I'm going to put this one in between my FFD and my original bend. And right now there's 2 bends and I don't want to get confused. So I'm going to name the first one, which is the one that we already worked on, full bend. And this one I will name back bend, because I want this to bend the leaf a little bit backwards. So I'm going to click on fit to parent, make the strength negative just slightly. Make sure that I check on keep length so that the second bend is not affecting the length of my leaf. And as you can see, my original leaf is going backwards while my instance is going forwards. And that is because my instance is rotated 180 degrees, so it kind of works like a mirror. Now, of course, I want to make sure that I hide this bend. And we are done modeling. Let's give this some color. So to create a material, you can double click down here or press the plus sign. And this material is going to be for my pot, which I wanted to look kind of like a terracotta pot. So I'm gonna go to my attributes of the material and select a color that is kind of like terracotta. I'm going to click and drag this onto my pot and also onto the ring that's around the top of my pot. If I toggle open this menu, you can see that I have a small thumbnail of the material that I used on those two objects. Now I'm going to add another material, make this a dark brown, and add this to my soil. And continue adding materials like this. If you can't see the attributes of your material, make sure that you select it once and they will show up here. All right, looking great. Remember to press Command S or Control S to save periodically. Again, the best part about working with non-destructive geometry is that you can always go back and change things. So I'm looking at this and I was like, I kind of want this to have a little bit more life to it. So what I want is that I want my stem to bend a little bit and then my flower to follow along with it. So first I'm going to hide both my petals by holding Option and clicking on the visibility dots and bud. And I'm going to add a bend to my stem. So make it a child, fit to parent, and increase the strength a bit. Again, the order matters, so I'm just going to change this so that it is the second child. And as you can see, there's not enough segments here. You can see that it's kind of like divided harshly. There's not enough segments to give a smooth bend. So I'm going to increase my height segments to around 20. All right, so now I have my nice 35-degree bend. I'm going to hide my bend. And I'm going to bring back my bud and my petals. And now I want to move these. So I'm gonna group them so that this is a little easier. Petal buds, group them here, name this flower. And to make it easier to move, I'm going to use the same trick that we did earlier of changing your enable axis, making this to be in the center of where you wanna move it, and then going back and making sure that you disable your enable axis. If you try to move and only your axis is moving, it's probably because enable axis is checked on. And now I'm just going to move this using this blue axis band and position it where I want. I'm seeing here in my perspective view that my stem is showing through the flower. So all I'm going to do is just move it slightly forward in Z. And that's no more. So this is a lot better than before. I think now it is in its final form. So now we're going to save out the final version. So Command S or Control S, since we already have this flower saved. And we're going to render it out by going to our render to picture viewer, then going to save, format JPEG or PNG. Okay. And we're saving our flower here. Make sure that you upload both your Cinema 4D and your render to Blackboard. And that's it. This is our flower tutorial.